We are just gathering here. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the comments, share where you're joining from. If there's any specific questions you're hoping that get answered today for our panelists, please feel free to list them and we'll get going here shortly. Great. All right. Awesome. All right, we've got everybody here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone so much for joining our weekly webinar series. Excited to have you. Today we are talking all things volunteering with 3 absolute diehard experts on the topic, so I'm really excited to dig in. I just wanted to share from the outset, if you aren't familiar, Pond is a marketplace for all the tools and services you need for your organization. Just like all of the folks here are providers of services on Pond. So if you're not yet signed up, feel free to join. And if you've joined this webinar, you're actually going to get a $50 credit in your account for joining the session. Just make sure to fill out the survey at the end that we'll email to you. So we will remind everyone of that at the end. But without further ado, I'd love to start off going around with our panelists, having you share a few layers of your identity that are important to you, and also why is volunteering so important to you? I will start with Paige.
Hello, everyone. I'm Paige with VolunteerLocal, and I currently live in Nashville, Tennessee, from Durham, North Carolina. I've lived kind of all over. And I kind of got my start, at a young age, volunteering for various nonprofits in the area. I was raised in a very service-oriented family. But I would say that I really started to value volunteerism after I became a public school teacher. I taught high school English for 9 years, and that really opened my eyes to just the importance of like a service-oriented world. And so that kind of was my identity for a while. I am no longer a public school teacher. Last school year was my exit. And I think about it every day. I miss it. There's a huge kind of void in my life, not working with kids on a daily basis, but especially through the pandemic, having, volunteer tutors and also just like helping kids fill gaps in. I'm really, really passionate when VolunteerLocal has nonprofits that are focused on education come through. It makes my heart swell. So I would say that I kind of got my start in public education and just seeing how volunteerism can fill so many gaps that underfunded schools have. I started working for VolunteerLocal in the part-time capacity about 4 years ago. While I was a school teacher, I would go work, do kind of nonprofit work and outreach for VolunteerLocal after school. And so that kind of snowballed into where I am now, which is a more full-time capacity. And I'm also I love animals. And so I have gotten sucked into the fostering dogs area. And so I have 4 dogs at my house right now. 2 of them are mine officially, but I have been a foster fail a few times. And so we work with a lot of different animal shelters and all of that. So those are the 2 big pieces that have kind of pulled me into the volunteer sphere.
Thanks so much, Paige. And good metaphor, the snowball. I feel like most of the people in the chat are also experiencing their own snowball right now. Except for Sam. We'll get there in a second. He has no snow around him. All right, Geng, if you want to go next.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Geng Wang. It's not really phonetic. If it's helpful, it's pronounced like gung ho. And so I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Civic Champs. And in terms of why, volunteering is important for me, I think, personally, I've always done a lot of it. I think it brings me a lot of joy. It's a very, for me, actually a very selfish thing to do in terms of something that I enjoy and get a lot of value out of, particularly mentoring. That's the piece I really alike, whether that's students, fellow, younger entrepreneurs, things like that to get started. But I think one of the things that I think increasingly more about, especially in my role here at Civic Champs, is the power of volunteerism to bring our communities together, right? If you think about one of the few things that we can all align on, right, is, we don't want, people to go hungry in our communities. We don't want people to be homeless, right? And so volunteering, despite your, economic, political, whatever background, we could all start come together locally to help our communities. And I think that's really powerful, and something that I think brings me a lot of joy and sort of passion in sort of the day-to-day work that we do here. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Geng. Sam, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Sam Fankuchen. I'm the founder and CEO of Golden. Golden is my second social venture in the space related to the experience of volunteering, managing volunteers, managing data around these programs. And it's been something that's been, deeply interesting to me. I feel like it's my life's work, and I feel like it's been that way since I was in high school and first tried to volunteer. And my experience at that age was that it felt very hard to navigate the process of seeing what was out there and how to get involved in it. And I was exhaustive about all the ways that I went about trying to volunteer. And I feel like this is a shared experience for everyone on the call. So we'll start with that. It led me to, as an undergrad, pursue the field of social entrepreneurship at Stanford. I became the first student to major in that program there and designed an undergraduate program around it. Started a social venture, went back and wrote my master's thesis on how to recruit, retain, and optimize the lifetime value of volunteers. And then after, a stint working in, corporate strategy in-house in a large corporation, and then as a consultant, I came back and started Golden with the idea that using the experience I'd had working with large organizations, working with, well over 1,000 nonprofits when I was doing my master's research, how can we make the experience seamless for everybody, more personalized, and help people be the versions of themselves they want to be, and help organizers see what's happening with their programs in a way that helps them scale and work on their mission a lot better. So really proud of what our team's been able to accomplish at Golden. We feel very honored to be able to work on the work that we're doing. And then some parts of my identity that maybe not obvious, maybe are not obvious. Today I'm in Monterrey, Mexico. This is the hometown of my partner's family. So spending some time on the other side of the household means a lot to me, and just happy to be here with all of you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sam. And last but not least, Madison.
I love being on calls with Sam. I always feel like I'm going to learn something. I am Madison Mikhail Bush. I also, like many people on this call, have a bleeding heart, and that's why I'm still doing this. I feel like everybody who's wanted to do something has had that moment you're watching TV and you start crying because maybe, you're watching a sad puppy commercial and then you're sobbing, and, it leads you to do crazy things like start nonprofit tech initiatives. But volunteering is important to me because I just feel at the core of my being that everyone has something to contribute. Sometimes it's not money. Sometimes it's, your skills. Sometimes it's your time and whatever you can put into it. But I truly believe that every individual on this earth has something to contribute. And I started Point because I wanted to be able to connect the people in those bleeding hearts who are like me, crying at commercials, to the nonprofits that are doing good in our communities. And once I started talking to thousands of nonprofits, and those nonprofits at the local level, almost 8 out of 10 times were run by women. And they were all telling me the same thing. Women are saying, hey, we feel ignored in the tech space. We need other tools. We need connection to these bleeding heart people that they didn't have. So that's why Point exists, to help support those local women leaders, provide them with really great tech, and to help, again, people like all of us on this call who cry at commercials.
Thanks so much, Madison. And thank you, everybody. I think this is, a really unique gathering because the 4 folks on the line you might see as competitors, or they're all offering volunteer tech, but everybody is trying to solve the same problem and really passionate about it. So it's exciting to bring that together for a productive conversation for everybody. And with that, I'd love to just start with your take on the state of volunteerism. And Sam, maybe you can take this one first, given your academic background around the topic. But I'd love to just hear a bit of context on like where we were, where we are now, where you see things going. What's the state of play?
Yeah, and I'm going to assume that based on the cohort of people who are on this call, that we've all heard a lot of the standard themes about pandemic stuff. So if anybody wants to go deeper in that, we certainly can. But let's kind of take that for granted and see what's exciting now about what we've learned through the pandemic. A few themes that stick out to me personally, and I'm curious what everybody else on the panel thinks too. But some things that stick out to me personally are that what it required to function in the pandemic, these are not adjustments to people's plans to kind of shift and then revert back to the way things were. The beauty of the disruption that this has caused all of us in our programs is that it's trained us to think about incorporating new skill sets into our programs. And that can mean like not just virtual work, but distributed work, empowering people in the field, looking for more specific ways to take advantage of skills and other benefits that folks in your networks can offer, starting to think about more dynamic relationships that are not just defining somebody as a donor or a volunteer or an advocate or a board member, but looking at empowering people in your network across the networks where they exist to start to proliferate the wonderful work that your organization's doing. To me, those are some of the ideas that are exciting.
Gun, did you want to add in there? I saw you just went off mute.
No. I think all of that is right, and I was more reflecting on Sam's comment. I agree with Madison. I feel like I always learn something from Sam. The one reflection I had just as we're working with different folks in the space is that it does feel like people that have opened have not gone back to shutting back down, which I thought was really interesting as the waves come and go with the pandemic. Now that if you haven't restarted the program, sometimes people have postponed. But that's one thing I have noticed a little bit that's certainly interesting for us.
I think too, just to kind of add, and this maybe dips a little bit into the pandemic pieces, but there's just, at least from my perspective, all of the needs are still there, but I feel like the enthusiasm behind, the average person, where 5 years ago, people are like, oh yeah, I volunteer a few times a year. Whereas now people have gone from, being in offices and being surrounded by people to working from home all the time. And so there is that like need and urge for people to feel more connected to their communities. And so I think that has, dramatically changed the state of volunteerism in terms of people wanting and needing those opportunities to fill the gaps that we've all in different ways experienced over the last few years.
Awesome. And before we get into like optimization of a program or tech around a program, just to kind of level set, like not everyone needs a volunteer program, or it's not always furthering your mission. Madison, can you help lay out like how someone assesses, okay, we've got this legacy program. Is it serving us? Is this what our mission should be doing? Should we be investing more in this?
I think it's very difficult to go from a legacy volunteer program to thinking about not doing it. But I think that right now organizations are in such a time of transition across the nation. The competitive nature for volunteer recruitment is very high. Keeping those volunteers engaged is at an all-time low. It is very, very difficult to find those right people physically coming through your doors right now. So it is a good time to reassess. Of course, reassessing to see how you might divvy up the people power needed to do some of the things that you're currently doing is very difficult. You probably don't have the budget to bring in paid people to do some of that work. But I think it's the time to work smarter, not harder, and organization is the key, and that planning is the key to seeing if you can optimize those volunteer times. Can you do anything virtually? Can you create a project management plan to really keep people engaged? Can you leverage partnerships in your community and offset, a ton of a specific type of work to one partner? I think that when you're looking at your programs, think engagement first, about how you can keep those people coming back, and then really plan around that engagement strategy. It's a very, very it's a big question, right? It's not something that you can answer in 2 seconds. So I think that that's just like the mental framework you should be starting with. But again, this would be like a whole hour-long discussion, and it needs a deck and structure to really flesh out that question. But maybe that gives you some context of how you should be thinking about it.
Absolutely. And I think Ashley just mentioned in the comments too that the burnout that people experience may give them less capacity to volunteer. And I think what you just brought up, Madison, is being thoughtful and mindful of how you're engaging and differentiating is really key there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive, massive question that each organization, you should be at this point, I think, in your pandemic planning, really assessing. But again, you want to, and I think one of the challenges right now is don't ask too little of people, but don't ask too much. You kind of have to find that sweet spot, because that engagement sweet spot is asking them to contribute enough that they feel like they are, really contributing some level of impact to your organization. And sometimes those one-off events are really not keeping people involved.
To kind of piggyback off of what Madison said, and just, I'm curious, this might become a question more than a comment, but I feel like volunteerism is not historically a data-driven sphere from a nonprofit's perspective. And so that need to really look at, what types of opportunities are people actually coming back for? What, are they more likely to sign up for something if it means they can bring a friend and do a job in a pair, like those kind of things. And so I think when thinking about furthering one's cause, if you have significant volunteer turnover, revamping is an important thing. And so I feel like, at least in what I'm seeing in a lot of the nonprofits I've been interacting with over the last few months, the first questions that people are asking are, how can we manage our data? How can we look at these reports? And I think, compared to conversations with nonprofits I was having 3 years ago, data is way more the focus now than it ever was before, which it's a great thing, but it also can be a really messy thing if, all of a sudden a nonprofit who has been relying on the same core people showing up and they haven't worried as much about those data points now is saying, okay, we need to figure out exactly what our numbers look like so that we can build a more sustainable program. And so if anybody else wants to jump in on that, but I think that's one thing I've been thinking a lot about in the last few months is how can we not only just give people data tools, but teach them how to understand what that means for their programs.
Absolutely.
I think, Mitch, I'll just jump in real quick here. For me, a lot of times it's more around the capacity of the agency or the volunteer manager or coordinator, right? So I totally agree, right? Engagement is so important, and data is great, but you have to have the capacity to do those things. And so for me, when thinking about whether you should have a program or not, is really around, do you have the capacity to actually run it well? One of the great things about doing a reset that a lot of orgs have today is, they realize, maybe they have brought in some paid staff to do certain things, and they're like, oh, actually, this works better, right? And it's easier on vendors or whoever to work with a paid staff member. But the opportunity there is you can also reallocate your capacity, right? And to say, instead of just going back to what you used to do, think about, how you can reallocate some of that capacity to do new and different things that might be more interesting, actually.
One thing you brought up, Gun, quickly that I want to come back to, and then I'll get over to you, Sam, but you brought up that there may be something you paid for and realize it's better. This is something I see all the time where you get what you paid for when you're seeking volunteers for absolutely everything. Do you have a good rule of thumb or framework that you advise people when is it time to pay for expertise versus relying on volunteers?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think the more training, the more interactions, typically it's harder with volunteers. So we work with a lot of habitats, right? And so, as we talk to them, they'll tell you like what are good things for volunteers to work on and what are not, right? And so mudding, this is kind of like you put up like a certain amount of before you put on the sheets, is actually really tough for volunteers because it has to be very exact. And if you don't do exact, then you have to redo the whole thing. And so I think, I don't know if I have a metric, but generally I think again, maybe coming back to capacity, unless you have the capacity to train them well and manage them, it's, then, the more interactions or the harder the tasks, right? Generally, that's going to be tougher.
I'll weigh in because I'm inspired by some of the things that you've said, Geng. Partly related to how you think about volunteer resourcing and program design, and partly related to technology. I think all of us are like interested in these two things separately, but there's an interesting parallel between the program side and the technology side that I'm seeing just based on what everybody's seeing. So on the program side, if you think about a volunteer program as like the very defined set of projects and initiatives that you've been doing forever and how you take that over and manage it during the pandemic, I would imagine if that's the philosophy, and that's the philosophy most organizers have as a default, but if that's the philosophy you have, it's going to be very hard to get out of the spot where volunteering is secondary to everything else happening in the program. And this is a problem like all of us deal with. Like, is volunteering important? Is it as important as development? Is it as important as advocacy? Or like all these other things that happen in an organization? I would encourage everyone to think, what is the essence of the organization? What is, the purpose that you're setting out to accomplish? And what are the projects or needs that could be very professional and skills-based like mudding, or it could be very generic, like your typical standard volunteer opportunity. But if you can start to itemize what those touch points are, and you can start to broadcast them, then you can start to recruit the kinds of stakeholders that you want to have in your organization. And you got to start thinking a more dynamic way, like these are the needs I have as an organizer. What sort of person could come and handle these needs? Because the technology has evolved enough to be able to help you target the right kinds of volunteers for each of those roles. And they're all legitimate, and you're going to need a strategy where you have diverse resourcing. So like switching gears a little bit to think about technology, I think all of us like to think about technology as apps or websites, all of which we do. But the future of technology, like in the next 5 years, like from right now, it's happening through the next 5 years, we're going to see a huge transition to technology not really being the things that you interact with on a visual level. Technology these days is a lot about personalization, a lot about predictive experiences, and creating volunteer opportunities that break the mold of the opportunities that used to exist is now possible because of very powerful technology that shouldn't feel hard to use. So in the past, like when you're maybe looking at, for example, volunteer management software, the legacy systems that used to exist in this space were very much about time tracking. It's like you go in, this is the volunteer, this is how many hours they did, maybe this is where they work or go to school, and some notes or some feedback. Today, if you were to go look at volunteer management technology, it looks a lot like listing and tracking, maybe sending that data elsewhere. But in the future, and really what's happening now, is the technology is starting to learn about what your objectives are, and it's starting to make it easier for you to get answers to those objectives. So if you want to get more mileage out of technology to make finding skills-based and non-skills-based volunteers easier, it's really as basic as just starting with a list of like, I need somebody to help us with our social media. We need a bunch of volunteers to go do gleaning. We could use some PR strategy, whatever it is, just start to write a list. And when you get those things up and out there, you'll start to get volunteers who will be engaged, to Madison's earlier point. But if you're thinking about we do the same exact volunteer opportunity we've been doing for the last 20 years. How do we get, more than 50% fulfillment of this time slot? And then you're in a losing battle because inevitably some people will churn out.
I think that's a really good call out to planning. The front end planning is so critical to any of your recruitment process, your engagement process, your engagement strategies. But then once you've done that front end planning, I'm dead. One sec. All right, I'm live. Okay. Once you've done that front end planning, then it's good to focus on the experience and what keeps people coming back. Like, for example, we tell nonprofits all the time, are you having volunteers come in a dead, quiet warehouse? Is it awkward? Do you want to cringe? Like, do you feel like you have to whisper? Like, me, socially, please put some music on. Think about the small changes that you can make after your planning process. Again, that recruitment strategy is super important. Get your stakeholders in the room, think about strategically who you need, and then think about your experience, what keeps people coming back. Shopping malls are dying. People don't want to leave their houses. Think about what gets people out of bed and what makes them excited. You might have to spend a couple dollars there, but if you can find something that feels attractive, that feels fun in some sort of way, it doesn't have to be fun, it could be meaningful, whatever your hook is to that experience, that's something to focus on as well.
I love that. And it feels like a lot of what both you and Sam have mentioned is it's a competitive business, recruiting and engaging volunteers. And you have to think about it more so like how you're recruiting and engaging donors. Either Paige or Gunn, whoever wants to go first, I'd love to hear maybe some specific examples. Your customers that are the best at this, what do they do? Who are the best at engaging their volunteers?
I think the word communication just comes to mind initially. Like, if you're not, consistently communicating with your volunteers, then you aren't making them feel connected to something bigger. And so I would definitely say the nonprofits that are, constantly reminding their volunteers of opportunities, broadcasting new ones, thanking them afterward, maybe even, sending certificates out or whatever that might be a few times a year. I think one, and this is like the teacher in me, if I taught a lesson 5 different ways and there was no consistency across my lessons, my kids would come to me way more often during office hours with questions. Same with volunteers. If you're sending them a different type of reminder message every, other day, and the communication and branding is all over the place, then you've kind of started to lose trust with your volunteer base. And so consistent communication, I think, is like the big underlying factor. If volunteers are going to trust you and your organization, they're going to need to hear from you and hear from you in regular ways that don't seem like we're all stumbling trying to figure out how we want to communicate something. So
I think for me, the examples, and perhaps not fair, right, is mentorship programs that we work with are often the best at this. But those are because they're very high touch, right? So I think about something like community champions. They do sort of a mentorship for kids that have cancer. They paired them up with somebody that's sort of in their field that they're really excited about, so to keep sort of them focused on the future and very positive, right? Super awesome. But programs like that, right, they'll have a staff member at every interaction. They touch base 5 to 10 minutes before to make sure that, to let them know how the kid's doing. But I think, as I think about, how could you do that in other organizations that may have hundreds, if not thousands of volunteers, like a food bank, et cetera? I think one thing Sam mentioned is personalization is, with technology can really help with that, right? So you can have the touch points that feel a little bit more personalized. But the other thing I noticed, again, I'll go back to habitats again. The ones that do this well often have a core group of volunteers, and it's not just your engagement with them, but empowering their engagement with each other can be super, super powerful too.
I love that. And again, which I think resonates with most people in the space, it's similar to peer-to-peer fundraising and who are going to be your amplifiers, and identifying them and engaging with them differently and intentionally is really important. One thing that came up in one of the questions that I thought might be helpful to answer from Jeannie was, she asked about a trend of, she sees a lot of people, at least in their profession, that are putting wanting to volunteer as like a check on their list or on their resume. And I think the question this brings up for me is like, how do you identify the promising volunteers? And if you are going to be pouring into people more within your program or within your volunteer program and pouring into your volunteers more, how do I identify the right places to do so and make that investment? Sam, do you have any experience there?
Sure. It's a great question with a lot of layers in it. So rather than trying to be very exhaustive about it, I'll just be very high level about it. And then if anyone wants to go deeper, maybe there's room for others to do that, or we can double down on the question. So much of service and so much of the problems with service, if you're looking at it with a more cynical lens, I'm going to look at it with a positive lens, but you could also look at this with a cynical lens. Service should have a degree of mutual value. When there is a power dynamic where somebody is doing something for somebody else out of pity or spite or savior complex, and this is a theme I've heard Madison talk about, and I'm sure all of us talk about a lot, but it's really important to think about situations where people are vulnerable or people are privileged, situations where there's an expectation from one party but not of the other party. And these are situations that don't lead to sustaining of a volunteer resource, let alone one who has a lot of potential. I think the way I would suggest that we think about it is much more like along the lines of the golden rule of having mutual respect, treating people the way you'd like to be treated, and giving people a sense of value that they can both contribute and receive with your interaction. So that can mean at the beginning of a session, helping celebrate people for coming, showing them the opportunity that they can help contribute to, getting genuine feedback from everybody involved about how things are going, finding additional opportunities and ways to re-engage people so that when you thank them, it's not just a thank you, it's like, thank you, and here's our next, set of responsibilities we can do together. And to the degree that you're able to manage the genuine sense of responsibility and ability across all of your interactions, communications, like Paige is saying, opportunity structure, the format and cadence of your opportunities, the understanding of the stakeholders you're serving and the benefits that they're receiving, the understanding of the populations who are sending volunteers to you and how you can continue to enrich those populations in a genuine way. Then it becomes a lot easier for people to come forward to you when they see opportunities where they can add more skills. You may not know exactly everybody's individual skills, but if they feel comfortable and they trust you and they feel deeply aligned to the work that you're doing, then it's a lot easier for them to notice opportunities for improvement and to feel like you want to hear that from them. But if you just check volunteers in and check volunteers out, it's very hard to develop that sense of trust.
I think that when we look at this, like Sam said, there's a lot of layers, but at the core of it, if someone is coming to, or not the core of it, the top layer, if someone's coming to you as a check off, they're, I did this, sign my paper, it's a CV boost or something of the sort, take it. They're walking through your door. Now it's your time to shine. Like, it's your time to hook them. So pull out all the stops, just like we had just talked about, like maybe those 4 things that you need to do to really run that successful program: the pre-planning, the brand and impact communications up front, during and after your program, your experience in relationship management, and then lastly, the expectations for that volunteer before and after the event. Those 4 things, when you really focus, on what's going to keep that volunteer coming back, or, in the business world, they're essentially an inbound lead, right? They're coming through your door. Now you just have to keep them there. Sometimes there's nothing you can do, but sometimes if you're able to communicate, like Sam is saying, if you're able to communicate the impact and the relationship building and the heart of how they're making a difference, they will stay. But most of the time, again, that experience, the communication, the expectation setting is what gets those people back. Sometimes you're going to lose them though. Like I wish to say everyone's going to stay in your door, but hey, they're going to walk out. But it is also a time for marketing. And it's also a time for them to potentially donate to your cause, because they're not going to forget it, either a good or a bad way.
And something you just brought up, Madison, I think is a really important topic, which is the Venn diagram between fundraising and volunteerism, and where that overlaps, and the delicate balance of wanting to engage your volunteers. And obviously you'd love more of them if they have the capacity to also be a donor and financially be supporting the organization. How do you balance that with not alienating someone who feels like they've already given a lot? What's the right timing? Paige, I see you nodding rather vigorously. Maybe you want to take the lead on that one.
No, I more so just I think about this a lot because VolunteerLocal is very focused on the volunteer piece. We are, integrated with some donor management softwares, but that I'm more so just nodding my head because I've been in that position before where I will volunteer for some, school group, and then all of a sudden I'm getting emails from them regularly asking to be a donor, and it is that weird like, oh, if this is coming, I think if someone is a consistent volunteer for any organization, it's, not out of the realm of possibility that they're also doing that for some other orgs. And so I often think about, what does that volunteer's inbox look like? Are they getting bombarded by, a lot of different directions to be both a donor and a volunteer? And so I'm probably not the best person to really answer the question. It more just pinged like an internal conflict I've been having with myself that maybe some other people on this call do have as well. I'm kind of curious what everybody's perspectives are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we talk about this a lot for Civic Champs. It's one of the things we tout, I guess, relative to others, right? Where with our micro donations feature, and so we think about this a lot. And I would say, the research is really clear, right? Volunteers are twice as likely to donate. They donate 10 times more over the lifetime of giving, et cetera, et cetera. Right. I think the challenge is, to Paige's point, how do you find that sort of middle point where they are still excited about you, and this is, I think, where technology can be helpful, right? I think historically it was very hard to actually ask all your volunteers for a donation because you don't know if they had a good experience or a bad experience, right? As Madison said. And so with tech, you do have that information. You can get the feedback to say, okay, I'm only going to ask people that had a great experience. And we know that the small dollar ask is generally the appropriate ask for a volunteer, right? Typically, my guidance is you don't want to do anything over $20, certainly, but it might be even slightly lower than that, right? You want to make it feel like it is a incremental thing to the time that they give in, or a tip, as somebody once said one time, right? So that's sort of, I think, the magic spot that we found. But certainly, I'm sure there's other ways to re-engage them as well.
At Point, we found if we itemize the ask for the donation, we're 4 times likely more to get the donation rather than asking for an amount. So we advise our nonprofits. We have a feature that's like it's called an in-kind registry. It's like a nonprofit version of wedding registry, essentially. And you can fund a certain item. So if you're at a community kitchen, you're like, guys, volunteers, hey, thanks for coming today. You might have noticed that our pots are shit. Can you buy us a new one? No pressure. Please leave if that's not an option for you. But we just want to throw it out there because you've given us a lot of help today, and we're just going to throw spaghetti at the wall. If you make it a non-committal ask, and you phrase it in a way and it associates with something that they've done, we find lots of success with that. So if you can think of ways you can itemize your asks in small ways that relate to the volunteer experience that will keep them coming back so they can come back in the kitchen and see their pots, it's has been a really, really great success story.
I love that, Madison. Thank you. And Gunn as well. Those are really great concrete examples that I think everyone can take into practice regardless of your processes. Someone just, Sharon just brought up in the chat here questions about tech's power to reduce burnout on volunteers, especially at smaller organizations where maybe you are relying more on volunteers. Sam, could you speak to a little bit of how you've seen this evolve over the years? Because there's obviously been huge progress in the technology that is available these days.
Yeah. I'll start by saying that, our core business, deceptively, as weird and crass as it sounds to use business terms in this environment, but our core business is data for organizers. So when you're running these programs, understanding what's happening with your program, who are you reaching, who are you engaging, who are you retaining, what networks are you working with, how much value are they driving to you, what does this mean in the context of all the other activities your organization's doing? That's really where our area of focus is. But I think a lot of people think of us in terms of the volunteer experience, particularly technology to enable a volunteer experience, primarily because I think, I'll take a little bit of credit, but if I don't deserve it, I think my colleagues here will call me out on it. But we really, when we launched our first native consumer mobile apps, we really created a category of technology that would allow anybody to discover and participate in these activities seamlessly, which by contrast, if you don't have mobile first technology to do this, what you're giving your volunteers is an experience where they have to find out about you somewhere. Then they have to figure out who's in charge of your program. Then they have to figure out where the front door is. Then they have to figure out if they're qualified, and then when to hear back from you, and what the schedule looks like, and if they have to do a background check, and if they have to do waivers, and if they have to commit to a year in advance, if they have to pay. There's just a lot of hurdles. Technology doesn't just eliminate those hurdles. It allows you to understand the people you're reaching in such a way that they only see the things that are well suited to them, which means the odds of them going are higher, the odds of them going back are higher, the odds of them being a really good champion for your organization across their networks are higher, et cetera. So technology can save you all of the time that it used to take to figure out how to get a listing together and where to put it, how to receive inbound people and schedule follow-ups with them, how to screen them, how to coordinate them, how to manage shifting, how to manage qualifications, how to manage legal requirements, often if you're regulated, COPA, HIPAA, GDPR, et cetera. All of that stuff can go away. And what you can have instead is the level of intimacy that you want to have with this participant, such that you can mutually have this story of evolving who they are, who you are, the work you're doing, and get them to give to their full potential if we're going back to donations. So I'll chime in on donations too. If you don't have real technology, like the real modern technology, what looking at the Venn diagram of the overlap of volunteers and donors looks like is maybe you have a list of who volunteered and how much volunteering they did. Maybe you import that list into some kind of CRM or email system, and you segment lists saying these people volunteered, these people didn't, these people donated in the past, these people didn't, some very basic things, and you send them emails or you send them texts, or maybe you use, peer-to-peer texting fundraising platforms, and you get other people to send similar texts that just say, will you donate, whatever, and then you hope that you get 1%, of people responding to that and giving you whatever amount of money they feel like. And that every year you have to earn those donors back and they're going to churn, and you have to figure out how you're going to get new donors in order to sustain the amount of money that you've been raising. If you have end-to-end technology, meaning that technology is involved in every part of the journey of the participant with your organization and your organizing of these programs, not only can you set automations to send out like fundraising asks or re-engagement asks in the right time, but you add so much value to that participant because they feel like you're only there to enrich their experience. You're only there to find out what they loved and give them more of that. So like if you look at what Geng was saying about micro donations, like let's say you do star ratings and you collect 4 or 5 star feedback from somebody, that person probably would welcome or not be mad about a fundraising request. So you can send it to them. But what if you have so much context, for example, about what they did and how they felt about your program in the moment, how often they come back, if they donate, when they donate, why they donate, what other programs, to what extent they're involved in these programs, if they came through school, if they came through a company, if they came through a religious or faith group. You can start to just understand them better. And when you understand them better, you can start to see patterns in the journeys that they're having. Maybe they're volunteering to fulfill a requirement. Okay, fine. There's still a way to give them a good experience. Maybe they're people building a skill. Maybe they're trying to figure out fulfillment in their lives. And these are a lot of different objectives that they have. And if you can find the common patterns of people that are going after those objectives, then you can give them a chance to give to their full potential. And that's where you get this sort of extraordinary exponential growth in fundraising. So typically, like, to give you a data point, when we have visibility into our own, we have some donation functionality under the covers, but we also work with a number of other systems that do donations. When we have visibility into the volunteering and donations, either our systems or partner systems, we can typically demonstrate within the first 30 days of being onboarded, something like a 6.5x improvement in throughput from the participants. And it's because we're not forcing people to just, dump out email lists, segment these email lists, and try and get donations. We're instead showing a very clear, point and shoot picture of what's happening, so that you, as the position of the organizer, can then help somebody be a better version of themselves by giving a little bit more, or doing something that they've just been waiting to be asked to do that's contextual to who they are.
Thanks, Sam. That's really, really helpful context. And something you brought up too, and I think is worth hitting on a bit more specifically, is that spectrum of sophistication around managing your volunteer program, saying that starts at like a piece of paper, then an Excel spreadsheet, and then a CRM. I've seen tons of, for constituent or customer relationship management tools that sell to nonprofits that advertise themselves as having volunteer management tools because you can flag someone as a volunteer. When is the right time? When do you know you're ready to graduate from managing your volunteer program in the same system as your donor data or other things? And how do you identify that, or where do you see people be at the right moment? Paige, did you want to start with that one?
Can you repeat the end of the question? I was still digesting some of what Sam said, so I'm like, yeah, will you repeat the end of that, Mitch?
No, sure, of course.
I'm catching on to what everybody else said about everything that Sam says is quite profound. So
I don't really feel like that. It may be my shortcomings. So I hope I didn't waste everyone's time with too many words.
Sorry, Mitch, go ahead.
I was just saying, when is it the right moment to be looking at volunteer-specific technology if you're currently managing your volunteer program out of a CRM, a spreadsheet, etc.?
So I think a lot of it goes back to, are you having high turnover? What's your retention rate like for volunteers? If they're not having an easy experience to find opportunities that apply to them, if the experience that they are having through whatever, process that coordinator's using at the moment, if it's a donor software, it's probably not going to be built, for volunteers. And so the actual sign up process is going to be rather frustrating for that volunteer if they're having to kind of hunt for where they even find those volunteer opportunities posted. And so I think a lot of it is going to be looking at the turnover data and just hearing what volunteers' experiences have been like, not the actual volunteering experience, but the process of finding those opportunities and the ease of that sign-up process. And so I think when I talk to nonprofits, a lot of times I hear them say, our volunteers are frustrated because it's not clear to them, where these opportunities are even posted. And so I think that is kind of the big point that we hear nonprofits come to us saying, we like how our, donor software works, or our CRM works, but our volunteers are letting us know that they just don't even feel like signing up because what they're seeing is not making sense and what we're posting is not making sense to all these different admin users and whatnot. So I think that's the big hinge point that we see, is that the ease of the volunteers experience is frustrating. If volunteers have to log into, one system and then another system and then remember this password and that password, it gets the burnout of just, your volunteers shouldn't get burned out from signing up for your opportunity. So that's kind of what we're seeing.
Madison, I know you were nodding pretty aggressively there. Would you want to jump in to add anything?
At the end of the day, donor management tools are not built for volunteers. So you really can't run a successful volunteer program on a donor management software. It's not built for it. You're going to be frustrated. They're going to be frustrated. If you're a small nonprofit and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to use multiple tools. Our tools, Point, Civic Champs, VolunteerLocal, Golden, integrate into donor management software to make your lives easier, because we understand that your time not sitting on the computer is the most valuable. You should be out there making relationships. And again, like Sam was saying, the end-to-end solution is important. You need to go from recruiting all the way to reporting on one software system for a volunteer. And you don't want to be taking data out, crunching your own numbers. Sometimes I talk to women that are running local volunteer initiatives, and they're literally doing it on Excel. I don't know, they're wizards, but that's not how you should be spending your time, because we've built tools to help you stop doing that. So again, to Sharon, you said, what do we do with our tiny nonprofit? Leverage tools to get you off your computer. Leverage tools to communicate with your board. If you want to use Boardable to have all of your information stored in one place so that your board is not bugging you all the time, you can always say, hey, it's always on Boardable. Go check it out. There are tools to help you get off the computer. That's all of our goals. So if you're a tiny nonprofit, there's hope. We're here to back you up. And if you feel bogged down by technology, all of our systems also have support that you can get trained to learn a little bit faster in those tips and tricks to get that learning curve or to get you more comfortable with the software tools. So don't freak out. If you have like 3 tools running your system, a donor management, maybe board management, maybe volunteer management, that's good. It will help you in the long run. Invest in it.
I'll chime in one more time too, just so some things are really clear. You want to find tools that all work together to do what you want to do. You don't want the tools working against each other, and you don't want any tool that requires you to go in and mark everything by hand, because that's usually going to be kind of the soft spot. So when you have end-to-end technology, meaning anytime somebody who's any kind of user, any kind of stakeholder associated with what you're doing has these kind of like very seamless automated touch points, all they're doing is taking work off your plate. They're taking all the things that you used to be entering by hand into whatever software or whatever piece of paper, and they're automatically putting it in there so that you don't have to do that work, and you have the integrity of all of that. It's also really important, if you're trying to grow, to think about what sort of tools you might use and look at a strategy where everything works together. So do things map the proper way to all these different systems? And for us, so we're supporting, just for a little bit of context. So, we support many grassroots organizations. Probably by and large, most of our users are grassroots, but we support over 10,000 organizations in the United States and beyond. And with a lot of those organizations, what you see is, maybe their mission changes over time, maybe their operations change over time, maybe they consolidate, maybe they split off. And so you need to be thinking about even the tools that you aren't using, so that someday you can see how they fit together. Because a lot of the times, like, let's say, we're working with habitats, or we're working with, a regional food recovery organization that's consolidated a bunch of food banks and food pantries. They're all using separate tools. Nobody told them what tools to use at once. And so when we're consolidating them, we want to make sure that they're working in a clear way in our system, but also somebody's using Blackbaud, Salesforce, whatever else, Microsoft, Benevity, Virtuous, it doesn't matter. Like, those systems will all show the clean exact same picture. So if you're, another way to look at it is, if you're using a CRM or donor management system that tries to keep you in their walled garden, you're probably trapping yourself and giving yourself what nerds would call technical debt. So it's something you're going to have to pay down later. You're going to have to pay the price for that. So find something that takes away your pain. Look, all the things that you're doing by hand, it eliminates it, but it positions what you're doing with that information in a way where everything can talk to each other in your organization, across your partner organizations, across other chapters of your organization, if your national entity wants you to roll them up. These days, there's a lot of political activity around, and also like corporate grant making activity around incentivizing performance. So if you don't have to do all this reporting and you just kind of have it in there, you're positioning yourself to get big grants from the government, from corporations, from foundations to accelerate your activities. This isn't just about like putting together a glossy report. It's about just having good hygiene and not a lot of nonsense work to be doing.
Yeah, I love that, Sam, highlighting the real I almost said real ROI, but the ROI that's quantifiable in a real financial sense, I think is really helpful in painting the bigger picture of why investments, time, strategy around these things are important. One thing you brought up that I'll try to hit on as our last question, if no one else has anything in the chat, the intersection with corporate engagement. I think a lot of times corporates wanting to send you volunteers, there's a power dynamic at play there where you feel like you need to bring them in. Maybe they're not even the best fit. I've been at corporate volunteer events that like weren't a good use of my time and wasn't a good use of their time. Like, how do you manage that? What's the right time to say like, no, thank you, we're good? How do you make the most of that? How do you make sure that leads to better corporate participation? I just would love to hear some thoughts on that. I don't know if Don, if you have something to share.
There's certainly a growing trend towards this, and more companies are doing ever more as their corporate social responsibility. It's a really hot space. It's everyone wants to get back. And I hear you, Mitch, right, in terms of like, oh, we're here to paint the wall again, right? That's the classic example of, BS things that now no one gets any value from. I think I think most companies want to do things that are meaningful, right? And their employees do as well. And so, for me, it's just having that conversation around, identifying your needs, like Madison and Sam said before, right? And having that plan of like, what is it that I actually need? And then being, sort of not necessarily brave, but upfront and saying like, hey, here's the things I could use help with. I think you have the employees that could help in these areas because they all have smart, talented people, and just asking for that, right? And then saying like, well, no, we can't do your 100%, volunteering event that for team building purposes. But what we can use your help with is actually, I need a marketing strategy, right? And this is going to be a much more meaningful engagement, right? And so being open and asking for the help that you need.
Just to quickly piggyback off that, or on that, the concept of like a corporation having a service day, while there's definitely a place for that, I think like just in thinking, especially after the pandemic, more sustainable volunteer opportunities, because, it's nice to have a bunch of volunteers come in to a nonprofit one day and clean the whole warehouse or do this thing, but it's like, is that actually forming a relationship? And so I think a lot of corporations and companies miss the mark because they're not focused on their company or corporation building the relationship with that nonprofit or group. And so I would urge anyone in that sphere to be really focusing on the relationship for sustainable volunteerism rather than just like the once a year where we check the box. So.
Absolutely.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Point and Golden have collaborative features in which companies and nonprofits can work together. I'm not sure if Civic Champs and VolunteerLocal do. You guys can jump in and correct me if I'm not representing your organizations well. But what we have at Point, we've really pushed our corporate partners because that's our business model. It's a buy-give model where companies subscribe to Point, point gifts, nonprofit licensures for free. We've really pushed our corporate clients to think broad or deep, not broad. And there was, there's lots of trends in social impact for corporate. We can definitely go into it. Again, these are massive conversations. But instead of just saying, everybody go volunteer anywhere possible, we're really asking organizations to think, what are the relationship building initiatives you can make within a cause vertical or within an organization, and how can you really challenge your employees to have lasting impact within an organization. This is against data trends where we see that people want to volunteer within a cause and not specifically correlated or tied to one organization anymore, but really pushing people to go against trend, to say, do what the nonprofit needs. And nonprofits, we need you to be very vocal, just like what Geng said. Be vocal about what you need, and also be protective of your corporation's time. Be super, super protective of that, so they understand that you understand the value of their time, the value of their dollar, and that you can be a really good partner. That might be saying no to painting a wall, but it might be challenging them and saying, hey, we know that you're so good at this. Let's use this as a professional building opportunity for your employees. And then let's leverage that for deeper impact. So those conversations are hard to have, but they are critical. And then there are also software tools like Point and Golden that you can use to manage that relationship and that investment back and forth. But Civic Champs, VolunteerLocal, I'll let you give the chance to say, hey, we do that too. But I'll step out.
No, we not a feature yet. No, we just focus on the nonprofits today. So
yeah, but being fearless, just like you said, it's so important.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know that there are like 10 other questions on my list I wanted to get to that we didn't get to cover because there's so much here, but I don't want to hold everybody over. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to our panelists. This was awesome. This recording will be live immediately afterwards on YouTube and LinkedIn. I know some people are asking about that, so you can share it. We'll also put a summary together that we'll send around to anyone who registered. And just make sure you fill out your survey for the session so that you can get $50 in your Pond account for attending. So don't forget that. The link's also on the website on the event page. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll be back here next Thursday talking about tech selection. Thank you.